Hello, everyone. My name is Wes Whiteside. I'm the Associate Director for Recruitment and Diversity at the Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. And I want to welcome you all to this amazing event that we have for you this week, Behind the Big Game, in regards to the Super Bowl. This is an exciting week for us and exciting week for everyone who loves the sport of football. And myself, I'm a football fan, and I had the opportunity to play all the way through college. So this is exciting for me. And before we start, I do want to take time to acknowledge, with the respect of the Onondaga Nation, the fire keepers of the Haudenosaunee, and the indigenous people whose ancestry's land Syracuse now stands. Also, I would like to introduce our speaker of the evening, Ann Osborne, Professor Osborne. She teaches here in the Newhouse School in our communications program. A little bit about Professor Osborne. She has done some amazing research in the area of sports. She does research on the area of gender and also fandom, which we're going to talk about this evening. She has a book, and actually has a book on its way. The book that she wrote is Female Fans of the NFL Taking Their Place in the Stand. And the book that she's working on is Transgender and Intersex Athletes Against Gender Binaries in Sports. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to one of my favorite professors, Ann Osborne. And before we start, because this is a fan day, I'm going to put on my Minnesota Vikings hat. Do not make fun of my Vikings. We had a terrible season. Ann also has her Pittsburgh Steelers flag too. So please put on your favorite fan or favorite team memorabilia and sit back and listen to the amazing Ann Osborne. So Ann, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Wes. I trust everyone can hear me okay. Wes, can you hear me fine? Give me a thumbs up so I know it's all right. Fantastic. Well, welcome everyone. And thank you guys so much for being here. I know on a Tuesday evening that this is, it's just super exciting that you came along to listen to me talk a little bit about sports fandom, a topic that I am very much excited to share with you guys. So I'm going to share my screen and take you through a PowerPoint just to give some context to what we are going to be talking about. So let me do this. Alrighty. So as Wes said, my name's Ann Osborne. I'm a professor in the communications department, and I am primarily what I consider a media sociologist. And so what that means is that I am interested in the reciprocal relationship between media and society. But I've spent the last probably decade plus doing research that is focused primarily on sports. And the reason that I'm focused so much on sports is because, so sorry, jumped ahead there. Let me back up a little bit. There we go. The reason that I'm focused so much on sports is incredibly powerful within American culture and arguably within world culture. It's often today said that sports is the new religion, that we go to sports games and we go into stadia and into arenas in the same way that we used to go to church or synagogue or the mosque. And so that really speaks to the power of sports. Sports is also an enormous economic power. So this is looking at the 20 highest rated television events pretty much in history. So since we've been keeping track of television ratings, and look at the Super Bowl year in and year out. So with the exception of the season finale of the show MASH, the Super Bowl accounts for 19 of the 20 highest rated television events. That speaks to the power of sports and particularly of football and the Super Bowl. And because of these high audiences, it's also the reason that a single 30-second commercial within the Super Bowl sells for $6.5 million this year. There are some estimates that actually put it as high as $7 million. So $7 million for 30 seconds of advertising. My friend and colleague is going to be talking more about advertising in relation to the Super Bowl on Thursday. So I hope some of you are able to come listen to Beth Egan talk about that. But again, what I'm interested in is the fact that this is such a huge cultural phenomenon, that we flock to sports in a way that we really don't any other cultural events. And so sports is also really powerful in shaping how we think about culture. And so if we think about in the last several decades, here are some images that sort of place sport in the realm of its cultural significance. So Helena de Portales, I believe is her last name, is the first woman, one of the first women to compete in the Olympics in the year 1900. And it was a major milestone for women, and it happened within the arena of sports. There's an image here in the top right corner of John Carlos and Tommy Smith raising black gloved fists at the 1968 Olympics after they had won in a track and field event. And they were doing it in protest to the civil rights that they didn't have in the United States. Of course, I imagine all of you know Colin Kaepernick, who took a knee similarly in a statement about the treatment of Black Americans in the United States, and did so in the arena of sports because of the platform that it gave him. The other two images here are Caster Semenya and Chris Mosier, two non-binary athletes. So they don't fit neatly into the gender binary that our culture tends to reinforce, male, female. And as such, they have really challenged their participation in sports, has challenged how we think about gender and how we think about how we structure gender in society. And so that's just some of the cultural importance of sports. And partly what I've been interested in as a researcher, and particularly around the area of fandom, is this gender issue. As Wes noted, most of my research has been done interested in gender issues. And so sport has largely been defined as an arena, a cultural phenomenon that reinforces masculinity. And I pulled a couple of quotes from other researchers who have talked about sports relationship to masculinity that I thought were really interesting and sort of encapsulate what I found interesting about sports. So Davis and Weaving wrote, "Sport is a site for the reproduction of masculine qualities esteemed in patriarchal society and critiqued in feminism. Success in sport is success in masculinity." So if you think about that, what it's really saying is that the things that we celebrate in terms of sports, strength, oftentimes aggression, football is a very head on. I'm a Steelers fan, and so we often talk about smash mouth football and this sort of very aggressive style of football that is played by some teams. And so oftentimes what we're really celebrating are qualities that are very much associated with masculinity, as opposed to qualities such as being nurturing and caring that we tend to associate with femininity. And so again, this sort of idea that sports is by its very nature a masculine endeavor. Here's another quote that I really like, that sport is an institution created by men for men. Women throughout most cultures and histories have remained largely marginalized in their participation in sport, so much so that the only legitimate role women occupy in sport is to spectate, support, and admire. And so what this quote's really talking about is the idea that women have largely been excluded from the major arenas of sports. If you think about the four big sports in the United States, football, baseball, basketball, and hockey, those four sports have been dominated by men who play those sports. Now, of course, there are women who play basketball and play basketball extremely well. There are women who play football, but the way that those leagues have been structured, celebrated, and supported has been predominantly within the role of men's athletics. And so what that leaves for women is for us to be fans. And so that's what I was really interested in. I was interested in this intersection of women, sports, fandom, and culture. For me, it all comes back to culture. And so I started doing my research looking at the English Premier League, actually. And I wasn't actually interested in gender as my primary thing. I was interested in the fact that Aston Villa Football Club, which is the EPL team in Birmingham, England, was purchased by Randy Lerner, who at that time owned the Cleveland Browns. And I was sort of struck by, what would it be like to have your team purchased, owned, and controlled by a foreign national entity or a foreign national person? You know, again, I'm a Steelers fan, and the Steelers have been owned and operated by the Rooney family forever. And so this idea that somebody could come in and purchase my team and take control of it was really kind of odd to me. I was sort of trying to think about that. And so that's sort of how I got engaged with this kind of research. And so while I was doing research on the EPL, I had the opportunity, I was traveling to England on a regular basis and watching soccer games. I'll also say, so I started out saying that I started getting into this research because of, you know, this interest in the power of sports and all of that. I got into this research largely because I am a sports fan, and it's really fun. I get to watch sports. I get to talk about sports. I get to watch people watch sports and then talk about how they watch sports. And so that is just a great joy. So that's should certainly be foregrounded in this conversation. But so I was traveling to England and I was watching EPL matches, and they looked like this. And I was going into these stadia and I was watching these games and looking around me, and I'm thinking, where are all the women? And this was happening at right about the same time that the NFL was making a concerted effort to start marketing towards women and attracting a female audience. And so it got me thinking about the research I'd always done related to gender. And now, as I was starting to move into this arena of sports, just looking around and thinking, where are the ladies? And so started thinking about this in relation to my sport, the sport that I follow the most, which is the NFL. So I have a question for you guys, and I hope that you're willing to just jump into the chat, share your ideas with me. Here's a question for you. Describe the NFL superfan. What does that person look like, and how do they behave? And I'm going to see if I can see what you're saying in the chat. Thoughts? Anybody? Giving you guys a few minutes to think about this. So if you're like me, when you think about what does the typical NFL fan look like, you're probably, oh, I see painted faces. Yeah, absolutely. You're probably picturing this guy, painted, yelling, pointing his finger, shaking his fist, snarling, often shirtless, often a little bit inebriated, right? So this is the person that we tend to think about as our NFL superfan. And again, I grew up following sports. I grew up as an NFL fan. And so when I see these images in the media, I don't see myself. And I don't see representations of me, and I don't see representations of how I'm expected to act when I go to a football game. And so that's part of what really got me interested in doing research around gender and sports. Oh, I see we've got a few answers from guests. Thank you, Wes. Wes is feeding me some answers. I'm having a hard time seeing in the format that we have. So fan caves, season tickets, lots of merch. Absolutely. Absolutely. So all of these things are ways that we think about fans, and we think about having that, we have to refer to it, right, as the man cave. And so the representations tend to be these very masculine representations. And so again, I come to this question about where are all of the women? And particularly, I said I started doing this research around the time that the NFL was making a concerted effort to market towards women. And so I see Jillian just wrote lots of drunk people. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so these are the kinds of representations that we see. The NFL is saying we want to make a concerted effort to attract a larger female fan base. And at the same time, they're also touting, and they've continued to tout, and it's worth touting, that 45% of their fan base is female. And so it's not that we don't ever see representations of women as fans, and we don't ever talk about women as fans, but they're largely left out of the discourse. And they're often left out of the discourse around fan research too. So if we think about the kind of research that has looked at fan behaviors, it has largely focused on European fan behaviors. And a lot of this was because of hooliganism. So there was a lot of interest in the kind of violent behavior that would often happen around fan behaviors. And a lot of that behavior tended to be masculine. So I see JP has a question here, but doesn't the typical EPL fan dwarf what we consider a rabid, oh my goodness, rabid NFL fan? Yes, yes, indeed. It really, we tend to think that our fandom here in the United States is pretty hardcore, but I will say attending EPL matches, it is a whole nother level. There is a degree of fandom within the EPL that is pretty remarkable. And it's because arguably that fandom is, we often hear people talk about tribalism within fandom. And a lot of the fandom within the EPL is still very much rooted to the local community in a way that we have sort of gotten away from because of the franchise system within the NFL and the fact that teams move. And so the Cleveland Browns are a classic example of that you had the Cleveland Browns that picked up and disappeared in the middle of the night and moved to Baltimore and became a team within the same division. And then you had the coach start an organization within Cincinnati, and then the Browns were resurrected in a way that we've never had a team resurrected within the same city. So there's this interesting, I think, delusion of the sort of fandom that happens because of that franchise system. I'm looking at comments here, so just give me 1 second so I can catch up to you guys. NFL finally start making women's jerseys. Ah, yeah. So Samantha points out that they started making women's jerseys, and with a flattering cut. So I'm going to come back to that because that's a really interesting point, Samantha. Jillian says, I feel that many assume I have no idea what I'm talking about when I watch, yet I typically get the call right, and it's frustrating. Oh, yes, absolutely. We will talk more about that as well. Because obviously men are generally the ones controlling the tickets. Oh, all right. Yep. I would love to hear, Luke, more about the idea of controlling the tickets. Do you mean that the men within the household buy the tickets and control them? Or is there another way that you're talking about control? And then Marcia says, definitely think of men, beer, guys high-fiving other guys. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm going to sorry, folks, backing up here to get back to some of what the research tells us about many of the things that you guys are pointing out. So there's this whole branch of research that talks about fan behaviors, that a lot of it focuses on this hooliganism. Luckily, it's not that we haven't had any of that in the United States, but that hasn't been a strong stream of research within the US. Most of the research on fandom within the US has focused on trying to fit fans into typologies, to try to categorize fans. So are fans authentic fans or bandwagon fans? Are they hot fans or cool fans? So all of these different ways that we can think about fans as being on a spectrum of either being a super big fan or a not really great fan? Are they direct consumers or indirect consumers? So do you go to the matches or don't you go to the matches? One of the things about this kind of research was that it often starts with an assumption about the kinds of behaviors that constitute real fandom. And it's a lot of the things that you guys are talking about, that you have a lot of merchandise, that you go to a lot of the games, that you have a man cave or a fan cave, that you talk about the games all the time, that you're well informed about the history of your team and about the history of the league. What's interesting is that the research would show, again, NFL touting, we have 45% of our fan base is female. But the research would go out and ask people about their behaviors, and it would often show that women were less authentic fans, that they didn't take it as seriously as men, that they didn't engage in the kinds of behaviors that men fans tended to engage in. And I started thinking about this, and I was thinking that, well, there have to be there's a disconnect here, right? So we have to figure out what's the research missing when we know that there are women who identify as fans, but they aren't enacting their fandom the same way that the super fan that we just saw pictures of, the drunk, painted fan, enacts their fandom. And then just quickly, there's another whole branch of research that looks at what motivates fans. And there's a lot of different things that motivate our fandom. It can be connection with community. It can be escapism. It can be an opportunity to behave in ways that we don't otherwise get to behave. At the end of the day, though, our fan associations are just like any other social group associations. We belong to fan groups because we identify with the team and we identify with the other fans. We want to be a part of the group. And we get to, what's Berging and Korfing is basking in reflected glory. When our team does well, we feel good about ourselves. And when our team does poorly, we might end up feeling poorly about ourselves, but we tend to mitigate that by trying to distance ourselves from our team. And we do the same thing with any other social group we belong to. When our social groups are lauded for doing something really well, if you think about if you are within your high school, if your high school won some big award, you get to feel proud of that, whether you were a part of it or not. But if your high school gets into some kind of trouble for something, you might feel, even if you had nothing to do with it, like you're being judged for that. And so fandom works exactly the same way. And so the research tends to look at that. So again, I'm asking this question again and again. So where are the women? Where are the women? Here's where we see women. Within the marketing towards female fans, we often see these hypersexualized images, and particularly in the early days of the NFL's efforts to reach out to women fans. And so I don't know if it was, Samantha here, who had written about, having jerseys that have a feminine cut. The earliest efforts to attract female fans was a trend that was been referred to as pink it and shrink it. So they would take the team jersey, put it out in shades of pink, often bedazzle it, and make it low cut or a crop top kind of shirt for women of a very particular size and arguably very particular age. And so we saw this sort of way of maintaining and reinforcing the stereotypes about women as sexy women in the earliest efforts to market. You also saw early efforts to market towards women that focused on game day fashion as fashion, that it was something that was meant to be fashionable that you could wear to the office. And here's an early ad that who says football isn't pretty. And so it was always this like sort of foregrounding women as women first and then fans as second. And this image that is the lower left-hand side is an image from an effort that the NFL had that was called home gating. And so this idea that women, apparently always in high heels, were hosting game day parties, and that was our role as fans, was to cook and to host a party, and that we were much more interested in the food and the decorations than what was happening on the field. So what about these women? The women who go to the games, the women who aren't interested in hosting parties, who want to be there cheering on their team, and that aren't that worried about how they look doing it. And so the book that Wes mentioned, The Female Fans of the NFL, was really about talking to these women and understanding their fan experiences. And what we found is that just like for men, for women, being a sports fan is all about having a sense of release, that you are able to get out some emotions I hold inside just yelling at the TV. I'm not even sometimes yelling at the game. I'm yelling at something that's bothering me in my own life, said one of the women that we spoke to. Another woman said, it's permission to act more manly. I think it's an environment that is more permissive of you. And so women saw their opportunity to sort of get out some of their aggression in the same way that men use sports fandom as a way to get out some aggression. But they also really want to be seen as authentic fans. They want to be seen as fans first, and not as women who happen to be fans, but as fans who happen to be women. And so this is a quote from one of the women that I interviewed, Kathy, and she's talking about her level of confidence in her fandom, that it's grown as she's gotten older. And I like how she sort of ends this. I don't feel like I have to act like I'm not a sports fan. I don't want to go to a football game and act like I'm just there to socialize with the woman next to me, because I'm not. She's there to see the game, just like every guy is assumed to be there to see the game. And so what we saw is that for women, their fandom is this complex negotiation of their identities. That, again, because sports is so very often a very masculinized event, that for men, their fan behaviors, their fandom, their affiliation for their teams is very much in line with their gender identity and their gendered expectations. But for women, there are very different gendered expectations. And those oftentimes come in conflict with trying to be a sports fan. And that's the reason when they were filling out these other surveys and these scales that measured how often do you talk about sports? How often do you dress in sports gear? How often do you go to the games? Oftentimes they don't do those things as often because they're not expected to, or they're not allowed to, for any number of social reasons. And so this is an image. Part of the research that I was doing, I was following the New Orleans Saints. I was living in Louisiana at the time, and I was following, one of the teams that I was following was the New Orleans Saints at the time that the New Orleans Saints won the Super Bowl. And so this is an image of a Super Bowl party that I attended. And all of the men, it wasn't structured this way. Nobody said that it had to be this way. It's just sort of how it shook out over the course of the evening, that all of the guys ended up outside under a carport in the dark, looking at a tiny little television and watching the game. Whereas the women ended up inside in front of this big, beautiful, large screen television, but they were inside, and look at the number of children. So the women throughout the entire game were negotiating, following their team, supporting their team, cheering for their team, and rocking babies and feeding children and keeping little kids entertained. Whereas the men just wandered outside and didn't have that added responsibility. And so we see this really clear visual representation of how the context for women's fandom is often different from the context for men's fandom. And the implications for this are, well, they're multiple, but some of the implications that I will point out is that women are a growing market in terms of their sports fandom and their engagement with sports generally. And advertisers have to know how to talk to women. And the NFL had a lot of missteps when it first started targeting women. They've made strides. They've gotten much better at recognizing that a way to a woman's heart is not always through a recipe, that we don't always want to be cooking. And the other implication is that those in the media need to consider how the media reinforce barriers to fandom for women and for other groups through the perpetuation of stereotypes that we see women presented as sexual objects through the media. We see women as seen as only interested in fashion. One of the things that we saw in looking at women's fandom through the lens of the NFL's apparel advertising is that women were never shown at the games. They were shown in the home, they were shown at parties, they were always shown looking really well put together, made up, but they were never shown at the games. And that's going to have an implication for how women see themselves within those roles, how women see whether or not they are welcome in the arena of football. So I'm going to stop there because I want to be able to get to your questions, the kinds of things that you guys have to ask. So let me end this. I will also say that in addition to the book that Wes mentioned on transgender athletes, I also have an edited volume coming out that is a volume that is specifically focused on sports fan and fandom, not just in the realm of gender, but looking at how fandom has changed because of new technology, how fandom has changed because of sports betting, how fandom has changed because of fantasy sports. So there's a lot in the world of fandom that is in flux right now. But the one thing that we know for certain about fandom is that it is a really powerful way that people identify. It's a really powerful way that people understand who they are and the group that they belong to. We also know from decades of research about the media that representation matters. Being able to see yourself in the media matters. And so when we bring those things together, it's important that we show women being fans and everyone being fans, that we don't limit the scope of fandom to one group of people. So I will stop there and I will take some questions if you have them. Wes, I'm not sure how you want to handle questions. Can people, they can only ask questions through the Q&A?
That is correct. Yep. So please put your questions in the Q&A section on your chat, and Professor Osborne will go through those and read them off. So as you were, going through, we did get a couple of people respond to some of your messages, especially in the area of fans. And as you see here, Mary is a huge Baltimore Ravens fan, and she was saying that they do specific events for women. And
Yes.
she's a season ticket holder as well too. So go
Yes.
Ravens, boo Steelers. That's what she says.
Yeah, Mary, that hurts my heart to see that, but but I understand. I often pick on the Ravens fans in my class, but not too much. Yeah, it's the NFL has learned from some past mistakes, and they really have tried to sort of adjust much of what they've done and to embrace women. And so the one thing that I will say about some of their early efforts to hold particular events for women was it was often educational events, which again assumes that men sort of are born with an innate knowledge of how the NFL and football functions, and that women need to be educated. And what they saw was that a lot of times women were coming to those events fully loaded with all of the knowledge that they needed. What they wanted was to interact with the players and interact with the team and to be celebrated for the fans that they already are, as opposed to sort of being cultivated into it. So let me see what else I have here. Why does a super fan have to be defined as being related to the visual, painted face, etc.? Can a super fan be someone who is simply overly loyal to a team, knows all of their statistics, etc.? Kenneth, I agree with you. Absolutely. And part of what I was interested in doing with the research that I was doing is to move us away from having this sort of one way that we think about who's a fan and only one way of being a fan, and that to be a super fan you have to be willing to go to a game, paint it, and all of that. It's it's so the way that I think about fandom and the sort of theory that my colleague and I, I have a partner that I do most of this work with, the way that we think about fandom is that it sort of functions along two continua. Yeah, I think that's the plural of continuum. So there is a sort of knowing component to fandom, which is the things that you're talking about, knowing all the statistics, knowing your team's history to be able to rattle off your team's lineup. So there's that part of being a fan, but then there's this affective part of being a fan that is really more about the emotional connection that you feel. And that can come from a lot of different things. I would imagine a lot of you support the team that someone in your family supported, and it's a way for you to connect with that family member. It might be that it was something that a friend group got you into, and it was a way for you to have the social experience of going to games with a group of people. And so there's an emotional component to it as well. So it's both of those things. The other thing I think is really important that we lose about fandom in the way that it has traditionally been measured, it changes over time, right? Like, we aren't consistently always a fan of our team in the same way. And for some people that might sound like a controversial kind of thing, because we might sort of get touchy about, well, you have to support your team in good times and in bad. That is an aspect of fandom, but in reality, we get busy some years and we get distracted, and so we don't follow our team to the extent that maybe we did the year before, or we are consumed with some other events in our lives and our fandom takes a back seat to what it might have been. As we get older, our fandom changes. So fandom isn't something that's consistent. I will say I was a big Steelers fan when I was a kid. I spent a lot of years not paying really any attention to the NFL. And then I came back to it and sort of renewed my fandom. So it isn't something that is static. It's not just something that you are. And then once you are, it's always the same. Let me see what else I have. So Jillian says, I think that how the female fans are depicted as still being sensitive and sexy when you watch the games, both Professor and college, you tend to see cameras focused on the very attractive and also the females in tears. That's a great observation, Jillian. I often tell the story of when I was doing this research. And again, this is such an enormous privilege. I recognize that I got to travel around the country and watch football, but I was traveling. So the research for the book was focused on the New Orleans Saints, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Cleveland Browns for a bunch of different reasons. But I flew to Cleveland for a game, and I actually was watching the Browns play the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I sat in the dog pound, which is the sort of Uber fan section for the Cleveland Browns. And on my way home, I got onto the plane and just happened to be seated next to somebody that I knew from Louisiana, who is the producer for CBS Sports. And so he had been there producing the game that night. And so on our way back, I was asking him about how he chose his live shots. And without missing a beat, he was like, well, we go to the crowd for emotion. Like, that's the thing we generally want. And he was like, we often get women who are crying and men who are cheering and mad and aggressive. And I was like, well, don't you ever get men who are crying? And don't you ever see women who are mad and aggressive? And he was like, well, yeah, I guess. He was like, I just, I just generally say, give me an emotive shot. And those are the shots that are fed to him. And he just never really thought about how that's reinforcing these cultural expectations. And Lauren, your point that it's all very male gazy. Yes, I absolutely agree with that. So let's see here. I've got Sam, or whoa, did I lose Sam? There's Sam. Good example of what would be that Bengals fans in his 90s that was overjoyed when they went to the Super Bowl. Obviously, had been a super fan of the Bengals for a long time, yet it didn't see him wearing anything Bengals. Yeah, I mean, again, this idea that there's one way to be a fan, right? Like the way that we have emotional identification and attachment is not always outwardly visible. For some people, it is. And it's really important to those people to make clear to everyone around them that they're a fan of a particular team. But it's not that dissimilar to our other identities, right? There are some of our identities that are pretty clearly visible. I mean, I'm a white woman. I present as a white woman, and most people who look at me are going to see me as a white woman. But without knowing anything about me, simply looking at me, you aren't going to know whether I am particularly devout within a faith or what my sexuality is. So there are all of these other aspects of my identity that, unless I choose to volunteer those, you may not know. And that doesn't necessarily indicate how much that's meaningful to me, whether or not I share that with you. So I think that the Bengals fan is a great example of that. JP asks, and if I'm missing people, I'm sorry. Somehow these are like sort of jumping around a little bit. I wonder if you've encountered research about female fans at women's pro basketball and women's pro soccer. Mothers who bring their children to those sporting events perhaps see the athletes more likely as role models for their kids than anyone might do so with men's sports contests. Any thoughts about the different motivations at play? Yeah. Oh, JP, that's a great question. There is a lot of growing research around the role of female athletics and the fan bases for female athletics. I think traditionally we've always sort of assumed that women's sports attract women fans, but that's not always the case. And I think it's really exciting to see, something like the US women's national team, soccer, and the World Cup. I mean, the amazing outpouring of support for that team was cut across all genders. And so I think that your assumption that people might see the athletes as role models and might be more inclined to bring their kids to those games is probably true. But I think we're starting to see that you don't need male athletes to be role models for men, and you don't need female athletes to be role models only for young girls. And I mean, I personally think that that's a positive thing, that good athleticism is good athleticism and good sportsmanship is good sportsmanship. I've always wondered why women who cover the games are always placed on the field. Lately, it's all women who get the brief comments from the coaches before halftime. Yeah, that's a great question as well. I think that it is, as women were moving into sports media, it was the role that was allotted them. And I think that we are seeing that shifting and changing. We are seeing women move into play-by-play. We are seeing women move into sports analysis and sports analytics. And that's all a positive thing. But I think that traditionally it was because there was a perception that women didn't know the game well enough to be play-by-play, to call play-by-play or to analyze the games. And so that was the role that was given them. And again,
Professor Osborne, I will also say to that too, we have an amazing professor here at Newhouse who's going to be doing Thursday's program,
yes.
The More Than Tackles and Touchdowns, who is our professor, Olivia Stomsky. She actually is a producer. So she produces live sport events. So, to that question, where women, like, we actually have someone who is in the background doing the producing and telling the people where to go and what shots to shoot. So if you want to hear about
the
that,
whole show, she is in charge and she is phenomenal. So I encourage you, if you can, to attend that session on Thursday, because I've seen Professor Stomsky talk about what she does, and it is awe-inspiring. Absolutely. So Claire asked, do you expect any fandom to falter or decrease due to the current racial controversies in the NFL hiring processes? Yeah, I do, actually. I mean, I will say my own fandom has waned, not just because of that, but because of issues with CTE and just sort of feeling like it's an incredibly violent, dangerous sport, and sitting and watching it and taking joy out of watching people really risk their health and well-being is a little troubling for me. And then you factor into it also the issues with race and the structure of the NFL, where you have almost 100% white ownership, almost 100% white coaches, and a predominantly Black and person of color athletes. It's, yeah, I think it's troubling. And I think for a lot of people, there may be some distancing of themselves from that. Lauren asks, how do you feel the demographics of NFL front offices affect public's perception of the football fan? Again, I think it's very similar to what I said to Claire. I think that that I think that the people in the front office, we are all limited oftentimes by our own perspective, and we have a hard time seeing past our own perspective without giving it conscious effort. And so I think the fact that the front offices, the management, the ownership is predominantly white and predominantly male, I think that those demographics are going to color how they see why people engage with the NFL, how they engage with the NFL, and who engages with the NFL. And so it's not surprising, again, that some of the early efforts to attract a female audience faltered, because I think the people who were in charge of greenlighting the ads didn't really understand the audience. And that's common. That happens all the time in advertising. Brad Gorham asks, how do you think the increased accessibility of sports betting will impact fandom? Oh, another good question. So this isn't my area of research, but as the editor to this volume, I have had the opportunity to read a lot about all kinds of aspects of fandom. And one of the things that the research seems to be suggesting, and it's kind of early days, the sort of betting phenomenon is accelerating. And so a lot like fantasy football, we're seeing a shift in how people's fandom is rooted, that we saw with fantasy football that people were willing to almost cheer against their team if it was going to mean that their fantasy team was going to perform well, or they were able to at least mitigate their bad feelings about their team performing badly if it meant that their fantasy team was going to do well. So I think that we're going to see with sports betting there's the potential there for there to be a conflict between your want to win a bet and make money and your fandom, because you may very well want to support your team, but recognize you're probably going to lose. And so do you bet against your own team? And what does that end up doing to erode your fandom? So I do think that there's going to be some really interesting research in the next several years that really kind of delves into that and how it changes. I will say it's one of the reasons I don't like fantasy football. I just don't understand it. My team is my team, and I'm not ever going to cheer for somebody else just because of my fantasy, but that's just me. So Claire says, many TikTok accounts for professional sports teams have been created and post funny content and comments on posts. Do you think this is a successful way to continue building fandom, maybe connecting with a broader audience? Absolutely. And I think that the fact that so many of the players are on social media, they are brands in and of themselves, and they are engaged with their fans, and they are tweeting during the games. I think all of that is just another way for us to build a connection and to have that line that ties us to our team and to the players. So absolutely, I think that those are smart efforts. Luke says, I think as a big Steelers fan myself, yay, go Steelers, having attended 4 games this year myself, the female fans have a huge presence. And I think by a lot of people, they're seen as fans, something that makes me proud to be a part of the fan base. Absolutely. I agree with that. And I think, again, I don't think the Steelers are unique in that. Having at this point traveled to a lot of different um, games, a lot of different leagues, I think that we are seeing a shift. I think that um, the NFL put a lot of effort in. I think that effort is paying out. Um, I think what's now going to be really interesting is to sort of see how that equates to other sports. It's the majority of the research that has looked at female fans has looked at female fans of soccer and football, American football. And so I think that sort of expanding the research to look at how the female fan experience happens within hockey will be interesting. But I completely agree, Luke. I think that um, the women are there and the women are largely accepted. I will also, though, say not always. I was at a game not too long ago, and a group of women fans were trying to rally the other fans to cheer more. And the response chant from a bunch of male fans was, "Get back in the kitchen." And I was just really sort of taken by that. Yusha says, does any part of public relations take advantage from the issue that women's isolation from sports? Like, is there any company use tactic which support the idea that that women to get more involved in sports field so the company may sell more sports related products to women? Absolutely, absolutely. That's a great question. It was interesting when I was doing some of the research looking at how the NFL was marketing to women and they weren't doing a great job. There were a lot of other companies that were doing a great job. So there were companies that from everything from, like beer is always a major advertiser within sporting events. And those ads oftentimes presented women as more engaged fans than the NFL actually did. I'm trying to think of some other examples of other companies. Um, there was a wireless company. I don't know if it was Verizon or T-Mobile, but they had a great ad that really sort of acknowledged women as fans and featured women as fans. And I think that those are effective. So yes, absolutely. Jesse asks, do you think that the increased female referees and female coaches can increase the number of fans? Yes, I think it does. I think, again, representation matters, and being able to see that you have women doing play-by-play, women who are doing analysis, as well as women on the sidelines, as well as women coaching, as well as women as refs. I think all of those things make women feel like they have a place within football. And I think it helps to attract women. Interesting to think that the fandom you speak about is identical to music fans, though it's not as gender specific as sports fandom. Go to a concert or festival, men and women are equally fans. Yeah, the work that I do on fandom draws from a huge body of literature in cultural studies looking at fans of anything, fans of music, fans of comic books, and it's all about being part of a community and feeling like you are accepted as part of a community. And I think for a long time, women didn't feel like they were well accepted within that community, but it's starting to shift. And I think that I would imagine that within music, there are some genres that are more accepting of women as fans than others. But yes, I think that fandom is fandom. Ava says, how do you get people like your producer friend to be more knowledgeable about the gender stereotypes they're perpetuating? I agree that representation matters. Yeah, well, I think talking to them, I think having the conversation, I think, it's one of the things that we at Newhouse really make an effort to talk about how the media have the power to shape our understanding of gender, of race, of sexuality, of national identity, of all of these different aspects of who we are. And the more that we're conscious of that, then the more when we become media producers, we can think about that. can a true sports fan root for more than one team? I believe you can, Kenneth. That's my belief because I actually have an AFC team and I have an NFC team. So I am first and foremost a Steelers fan, but I am also very much a New Orleans Saints fan. And so my dream is a purely black and gold Super Bowl because there's no way I lose in that scenario. So I believe you can. Angela says, also from the production side, there are very few women producing or directing the games. No one in the control booth or calling the game. Same with the issue around race. Yes, absolutely. And it matters. It matters how we frame the narratives. It matters what shots we think to take. It matters in so many different ways. Who is behind the camera influences what narratives are produced in front of the camera and for the audience. And so absolutely. Are there differences in female fandom between college and professional sports? I think there are differences in fandom, period, between college and professional sports. I mean, college fandom, so much of it is about a place in time that there are some teams. Syracuse is actually a pretty decent example of that. Part of we often talk about or like to think about Syracuse as New York's team, the college team for the entire state. So there are people who might not have a strong affiliation with Syracuse University, like that didn't go to Syracuse University, who might choose to be Syracuse University fans. But by and large, fandom at the college level is born out of that association with the school itself. And so I think that's different from the professional sports fandom. What you described by the fans shouting, "Get back in the kitchen," sounds like toxic masculinity. Yes, it does. If the NFL wants to get more women fans, they should address this, don't you think? Yes, I do. And they do. They try. I mean, I think most games that you go to, you will see there's a, see something, say something kind of thing, and you can text and say that there's whatever kind of bad behavior is happening, and you can report it and have those fans removed. And I think that is the kind of behavior that hopefully they're interested in policing. So I think we have time for one more question. So Lily says, how do you think the issue of the lack of female commentators can be solved? I think that it is being solved. I think it is getting better. And I think it is being solved and getting better because we're having the conversation. And we have schools like Newhouse that have amazing people like Professor Olivia Stomsky, who are training the next generation of women to go into sports media and building a network that includes women who are then pulling other women up. And so I think that's how that kind of change happens. It happens by recognizing there's an issue, recognizing that it should be solved, and then people going out of their way to find people to fill those roles. And again, it's not just about gender, it's also about race, it's about all sorts of representation that we need to broaden. I think I'm done, Wes.
All right. Well, Professor Osborne, thank you so much for that well done presentation. We appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. And now we learn a little bit more about fandom. As we cheer on our game this weekend, and the gentleman said, can you cheer for two teams? Honestly, I'm originally from from Detroit. And I will say that the Detroit Lions, I'm calling them the Detroit Rams now because they've been cheering so much for Matthew Stafford, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen in my life. But Detroit hasn't won anything ever. But so I see why they're cheering for him. So yes, you can do that. So we want to thank, like I said, Professor Osborne, thank you so much for being here and discussing. And we want to thank you all
for coming.
Yes,
thank you. This has been an amazing conversation. You guys asked such fabulous questions. So thank you.
Yeah, so we want to say thank you all, alums, current students, prospective students, thank you for joining. And then also, I do want to let you know that there are a couple of things that are here. So I'm going to share my screen with you all. And as you see, can you see the two sessions, Anne? Right?
I can.
Okay, so Two of our students actually did an Instagram takeover. So check that out. Follow us. Newhouse SU. You can see Jaron May and Ben Showman. They're currently at the Super Bowl right now. They did an Instagram takeover. Go check that out. And then tomorrow's event, which I'm excited about the halftime show, the Rock the Show with Professor Michelle Santos Suoso. So please register to that the same way you registered for professors this evening. You can do that as well. So we want to thank you for coming. I also want to thank my colleague, Christina Kinsey, for being here. Also Brian Tibbins for running this, and then also Sally doing the captioning for us as well. So thank you all for coming, and please be safe, stay healthy. And as we say here at Syracuse University, go Orange.
Go Orange. You can find me online. If anyone has further questions, reach out.